Good morning and thank you. My name is Ben Masek. I am the Business Development Lead for Media Entertainment here at AWS. And what I'd like to do today is give you a better understanding and overview of how we're working with many media customers, helping them innovate and ultimately working to perfect their media experience. Last Friday, we heard of some fairly groundbreaking news. Bob Iger with Disney announced the new formal service, Disney+. This actually is a game changer and is very much in line with so much of the transformations that we've been experiencing, that we've been seeing throughout the media and entertainment industry, especially over the last 2 to 3 years. So much of it has to do with adapting to these shifts in terms of how many of our consumers, our viewers, are wanting to experience content. The Disney announcement for Disney Plus ultimately is stating that they will be launching their service, I believe, right around early November, around November 12th. And it was actually following an announcement by Apple TV Plus. So Tim Cook with Apple announced the Apple TV Plus streaming service just about 2 weeks ago as well. And many others throughout the industry ultimately are in the process of revamping their direct-to-consumer, otherwise known as D2C, types of strategies. Much of this is on the heels of some very transformational announcements throughout 2018 involving a variety of mergers and acquisitions. We actually saw over $200 billion in M&A activity in 2018, whether it was AT&T purchasing Time Warner and Warner Media assets, or Disney actually purchasing a lot of the Fox assets to help as they're building out their new direct-to-consumer type strategy. NBC Universal, Comcast, purchased Sky PLC. Scripps was purchased by Discovery along the way. So all in all, we're seeing a lot of these traditional broadcasters, a lot of these traditional studios wanting to focus on scale, on building out larger content libraries, and much of this plays into their transformation towards direct-to-consumer. Along with building out scale, so much of what these traditional companies are doing is ultimately seeking larger global audiences, being able to leverage this content that they have, and then incrementally extending that content viewership, that actual global audience reach, to a much broader base. And along the way, I'd say the final big massive change that we're seeing throughout the industry has to do with the transformation of media workflows. And we'll talk through many examples as far as how our customers are experiencing these changes, how they're utilizing a variety of cloud-based technologies to transform their media workflows. Bob Iger really summed these transitions best. This was a quote, I believe, from about a year ago or so, in which Bob Iger properly characterizes this profound shift throughout the industry. For many of us, many of you in this audience, we've actually been in this business for quite some time. And certainly when I started in this business a little over 20 years ago, much of the talk was about content is king, or even in some cases, distribution is king. And what we're finding is that in this new era, content is extremely important, extremely valuable, but its primary purpose is ultimately to delight our audiences. And the main drivers in terms of where our industry is going is directly dependent on shifts that our audience, our consumers, our viewers are ultimately pressing for. And these drivers ultimately sum up to two primary categories. Our viewers want better user experience. They want more access to more content, more niche content. They also are looking for a more personalized experience. And our customers, many of you in this audience, are ultimately adapting your business models based on those drivers. You're needing, for instance, to build out more global video platforms so that you can reach many of your audiences in a more global, latency-sensitive type manner. You're also working in many cases to better connect with viewers. And this is the second part of the puzzle, this ability to more closely engage with customers. We're shifting from this world of what for so long was mostly about broadcast, right? We would have content, we would broadcast it out, mostly in a multicast type way. The new shift is to begin thinking more in a unicast type of frame of mind, to actually have more of a one-to-one interaction with the end consumer, to learn more about your consumers. And AWS, from a cloud perspective, has been very engaged with customers to help with these transformations. And through the examples that we'll discuss, there are two primary areas where we're seeing a lot of engagement. The first has to do with digital media workflows, with this ability, for instance, to build out over-the-top streaming experiences in a cloud-type environment, to automate your supply chain, to build out better asset management solutions and whatnot. Secondly, and this is much more recent, a lot of the focus in terms of how we're seeing customers innovate has to do with leveraging ML, machine learning, as well as AI, artificial intelligence types of services to, in conjunction with analytics, to ultimately help transform and engage in a more personalized way with your customers, and also to utilize these same technologies to help automate the operations that you're utilizing in your environments. AWS has actually been involved with many media customers for several years. So our more prominent customers, we'll talk about Netflix here in a bit. During the early days, we're primarily focused around areas such as streaming delivery, or maybe transcoding at scale, processing a lot of that video content. But over the last 2 to 3 years especially, we've actually very quickly been adapting to movement that our customers have been pushing us towards, which is getting more involved with supply chain as well as asset management, and then more importantly, directly involved with the actual creation of content, with post-production processes. And so what you're seeing on this chart really represents the entirety of the media lifecycle. And this ultimately is where AWS is engaged with customers throughout the entirety, from initial camera lens, from actual camera capture, all the way through supply chain of transforming that content, to then the different forms of distribution, whether it's digital streaming, over the top, OTT, or even broadcast playout, publishing, and so on. The other big game changer, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with machine learning and analytics. And we'll also talk through some examples as far as how machine learning is helping automate and operationalize aspects of your digital media workflows, and then more importantly, helping many of our customers more personally engage with their fan base, and also helping with cost reductions. Here's a very similar view where we call out some of the many customers that we've been innovating with. And I'll mention a few of these different customers as we start talking about the manners exactly in which these customers are transforming some of their media workflows, some of their media workloads, and engaging with customers utilizing the power of cloud. The manner in which our customers are actually transforming and moving to a cloud, their cloud journey itself has one commonality, and that is to leverage a lot of the AWS core services, a lot of the infrastructure primitives, whether it's storage, compute, database, machine learning, CloudFront for CDN, content distribution network types of needs. All of our customers at the core are utilizing these base services. Some of our customers, I'd say it's more a rarity than normalcy, are actually building out the entirety of their media application stack, their media application platforms, utilizing custom-based solutions. These are situations like that of Netflix, for instance, that has many highly qualified, very well-trained media technologists, and they're very focused on having just full control over that part of the stack. But what we find is that the vast majority of our customers mostly are focused on leveraging a partner ecosystem, of leveraging a lot of existing partner solutions that they may have worked with in the past in on-prem type environments, and are utilizing these partner solutions to very quickly accelerate their adoption towards cloud. And we're fortunate in that we have a team that works directly with many of these partners and is helping with that transformation. And finally, a big shift in terms of our strategy working with customers is actually directly driven by feedback that we've received from many of you. Over the years, we've seen a lot of interest around some basic media workflow, media service capabilities. And based on this feedback, about 4 years ago, we acquired a company called Elemental. And AWS Elemental, we'll talk about a few examples where we have many customers that are now utilizing their base media services. And there's a talk later with Jason that will go into more details around how Elemental is really very rapidly helping customers innovate and transform the media workflows in cloud. We also acquired a company about 2.5 years ago called ThinkBox. They have a product called Deadline, and same thing. The ThinkBox acquisition brought us not only some initial products, some initial services to help with the transformation of content production workflows, but more importantly, also brought AWS much needed expertise as far as experts who can provide a lot of that knowledge around content production workflows. And we'll provide some examples of that here in a couple slides. Before I get there, I just wanted to call out one additional shift in strategy, or part of our evolution in terms of our media strategy at AWS. And this has to do with, once again, listening to a lot of the feedback of so many of you in this room and our customers worldwide around a desire to, in some cases, for some of the more common media workflows, to actually provide customers with media solutions, and in some cases what we call media starter kits. We'll actually show a couple examples of this in a few slides, but the main point of these media solutions is to actually provide you with a starting point by which you can start developing more complex, more advanced media workflows based on, once again, a few set of common basic solutions. And what you'll find with each of these common solutions, and when you get a chance, please go to aws.amazon.com/media/solutions. What you're going to find are 9 different solutions and starter kits for which you can actually, in many cases, download, sometimes with a one-click download, you can actually launch a CloudFormation template, and literally within minutes, you're going to have up and running, for instance, an over-the-top live streaming solution, or maybe even see what a live subtitling and translation solution might be. Or one of my favorites, a very recent solution that we just built out, is a media-to-cloud-based solution. And once again, what you'll find with these different solutions or starter kits is that these are primarily meant to demonstrate how you can take a variety of different AWS services, as well as in some cases partner solution components, and then have them pieced together and ultimately what results in a solution that will provide you with direct, accelerated outcomes to build out some of these use cases. And of course, the benefits are multiple, but I'd say the primary benefit that I'm seeing with many customers really has to do with just an acceleration of your journey towards cloud, of being able to leverage what, in essence, are well-architected solutions. So you're going to learn from some of our solution architects and partners of how some of these better, well-architected solutions will take advantage, once again, of different AWS service primitives in association with partner solution components, and provide you with, once again, a more agile base solution that you can then incrementally add on to in order to accommodate your specific needs. What I'd like to do now, and pretty much through the rest of the presentation, is give you a little bit more insight in terms of how specific customers are actually working with AWS on their journey towards adapting their media capabilities. And we'll start off actually by going over some examples in the field of content creation production. We'll then carry on to examples throughout supply chain, with one example in digital asset management. We'll then go on to distribution use cases. And then finally, we'll tie a lot of this together by actually looking at how machine learning and analytics are also being used to help with these transformations. In terms of content creation and post-production, an area where cloud has actually become very involved with media customers, especially in the visual effects industry, has to do with rendering. So the actual rendering of visual effects shots, the rendering of all these different frames that make up animation sequences or special effects types of shots, this has become very commonplace in a cloud type environment. And so one of the better examples, more recent examples we have is working with a company called Mikros Animation. Mikros Animation is part of Technicolor. They're actually a visual effects subsidiary based out of Paris, France, and they were faced with a situation where they actually had 4.5 million hours to render out. And of course, they didn't have a lot of time to do this. And they were able to leverage the scale of AWS, in this case, 170,000 concurrent cores to ultimately render out in record time what otherwise would have taken probably too long to get to their end result. They were able to render out much of what amounted into the Sherlock Gnomes movie. Another example that was fairly recent is with Milk Visual Effects. A very similar situation. In the case of Milk Visual Effects, they have quite a bit of on-prem capacity, and they were certainly continuing on to plan on leveraging and utilizing their investment in their on-prem capabilities for rendering, but very quickly ran into a situation where they feared they might not have enough time to render everything out, and so utilized and extended, augmented their burst rendering capabilities over to AWS. In this case, they utilized up to 130,000 concurrent cores to successfully render out within 10 weeks what amounted to their movie. The manner in which a lot of this gets pieced together is usually from a rendering perspective, either in a hybrid environment or sometimes in an all-in cloud environment. And we could certainly walk you through both types. We're starting off by actually exposing a hybrid type environment. And the reason showing a hybrid environment is important to many of our customers is, as was explained earlier, many of our customers have a certain amount of fixed on-prem capacity. In most cases, they want to fully leverage and consume what they have in that on-prem environment. And then only if they believe they might be in a situation where they need that extra capacity, will they actually extend it in the cloud. And so much of what our specialists, our solution architects, and our experts at ThinkBox especially have been doing is creating services and architectures that allow for that seamless transition into a hybrid type state, so that pretty much without skipping a beat, if you need that augmented capacity, you will get it fairly quickly and move from your on-prem environment, which is shown on the left side, to being able to extend also into a cloud type environment, as we are showing right here on the right side of your screen. Another big area of focus within content production has to do with virtualizing creative, artistic types of activities, such as editing in a cloud type environment now, or even producing some of your modeling or animation for visual effects, for animation stories, and being able to do all of this in a cloud type environment. And this is exactly what Untold Stories, an interesting logo, but Untold Stories has done exactly that. Untold Stories decided to go full cloud native. And they really represent sort of the future of what we're seeing with content production, with visual effects type houses, that realize in many cases that there really isn't a need necessarily to invest in on-prem infrastructure. It's best for them to actually invest in making sure that they have talented artists, they have talented technologists that can help with creating what they're focused on doing, which is to create delightful visual effects shots and not have to worry about the infrastructure aspect of it, not have to worry about racking and stacking servers, for instance. And so in their case, really the extent of the hardware that they're purchasing really primarily just has to do with zero-client desktops. So with these zero-client desktops, they securely directly connect into an AWS region in which they have GPU-based workstations to run a lot of their creative tools and solutions for, once again, editing, for things such as modeling, dynamics, animation, and so on. And once again, we really believe that the future of content production is summarized in terms of this overall shift. Digital asset management supply chain is also now being used more and more by a lot of the prominent media customers worldwide that we've been working with. A good example of that is 21st Century Fox. In the case of 21st Century Fox, they were faced with a situation where they're continuing to see growth and just added technological needs, automation needs, operational burdens associated with their supply chain. They have a lot more content coming in. They have a lot more packages that they're needing to deliver to their many different distribution channels. And doing so and adapting to this based on a fixed on-prem environment was becoming much more complex. And so over the last year and a half or so, they've actually moved over 10 petabytes of content onto AWS. And a lot of what they've been able to accomplish is, first off, to automate many aspects of their supply chain so they can run a lot of their processing in a more automated fashion. Even a lot of the QC, for instance, can automatically be done and chained together as part of this supply chain, all running in a cloud-type environment. And this ultimately has provided them with better business agility. If need be, they can take on more work. They can actually deliver to more distribution channels when the need arises. Another great example in terms of use of asset management, in this case also use of certain aspects of machine learning, has to do with college football playoff. The CFP actually partnered with Veritone in this case, and what they now have is an ability to connect directly with up to 1,800 media partners. So when it's close to game time, when the CFP, when the college football playoffs actually occur, right around January, and actually even prior to that in December, what CFP is able to do with this new solution is exchange information. They're able to provide a lot of their partners with an easier to consume manner to actually pull any of the media assets that a lot of these partners may need in terms of allowing for a better experience. So a lot of the content that they may need for future workflows, digital media workflows, can be directly obtained in a digital immediate access type fashion. Distribution is where we're seeing a lot of activity. We've been seeing a lot of customers moving their distribution workflows onto AWS for quite some time. I made mention of Netflix earlier. As it turns out, Netflix is continuously innovating, continuously finding new ways to take advantage of cloud to help transform their business. And the big driver for Netflix, of course, was to find ways to reach a very broad, very large global audience. They now have over 140 million subscribers. I think as of the last slide, we were at 100 million, but that is growing very quickly. And what's great about Netflix is they're very creative, very innovative, once again, in terms of how they're able to use cloud. Netflix actually shut down their last major data center over 2 years ago, and most of their processes, most of their media workflows are actually running in an AWS type setting. Whether doing this for their recommendation engine or their supply chain type needs, much of this is being done now all in a cloud type environment, and very quickly adapting to the spectacular growth that Netflix has been showing. A slightly different distribution example, in this case, comes from a traditional broadcast customer. Turner Broadcast actually came up with this concept of a pop-up channel. And the idea behind a pop-up channel was primarily brought about by a few business decision makers who realized that in many situations, Turner has access to a certain amount of content that might not actually be turned into a broadcast channel. And in some cases, they'd like to have the flexibility of testing out new channels with some of this new content or existing content. And doing so in a traditional type manner would ultimately require that they make capital expenditures, that they purchase a lot of the servers, that they install those servers to allow for the creation of these broadcast streams. Turner, in this case, partnered with a great technology provider, Amagi, which is one of our AWS partners, and utilizing Amagi's solution is now able to provide a broadcast playout solution, all running in the cloud, all running, in this case, on AWS. And what this has provided Turner with, once again, is the business flexibility of being able to test out new concepts, in this case, new channels, without the risk necessarily of overspending on new infrastructure that might become obsolete should the channel not work out. In this case, of course, their investments from an infrastructure perspective are more OpEx, operational expenditures, and those operational expenditures can be quickly ramped up if the business idea turns into success. And finally, I'll spend a few minutes just trying to summarize some of the many movements that we're seeing in machine learning. To provide a little bit of context on this, what we've been seeing throughout AWS with our customers is just a mad rush towards determining how artificial intelligence, AI, as well as machine learning, ML, can help with a variety of different activities. In a media sense, there are some operational activities, automating supply chains, for instance. We'll talk a little bit about that in the case of Fox. So those are some of the ways in which ML are being used. Other ways have to do with creating better fan experiences, creating ways of monetizing content, of being able to, for instance, maybe provide more targeted ads. And then finally, another driver has to do with cost reduction. And what we'll do is we'll talk about a few of these different use cases, some great use cases that we've been seeing from many creative customers like yourselves have to do with, for instance, content moderation, contextual ad insertion, cataloging media, being able to provide multi-language metadata search, and some of the latest, more meaningful activities in terms of how ML is directly transforming the industry have to do with creating subtitles, creating closed captions, and allowing for real-time or near real-time translation, for instance. And so we'll talk quite a bit about our existing Amazon AI services, including recognition, both in terms of image as well as video. We'll talk about our natural language processing services, including Comprehend. We'll talk about some services that are focused on extraction of metadata from the audio channel. So we'll talk a little bit about Transcribe. We'll talk about Translate. And one of the newer services is Textract, which also helps in cases, for instance, where maybe you want to detect things like logos or text or even tables, actual data information in a tabular form, for instance, directly from images. One of my favorite examples, certainly I think my wife's favorite example when I've bored her going through this presentation, has to do with the royal wedding. And hopefully all of you witnessed the royal wedding last year with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. And one of the new aspects to the wedding was the actual use of recognition, of elemental services, and ultimately of just ML to provide a more meaningful, engaging experience for a lot of users. And so what we did is we worked with our customer, Sky News in this case. We also engaged a couple partners who provided some great capabilities to really turn the royal wedding experience into something that just had a lot more engagement. What was meaningful about the experience here was that they built out a mobile application that directly tied in to back-end systems that utilized machine learning to then detect different personalities that were present at the wedding invite. And what this ultimately did is it just provided that extra bit of information that allowed folks like my wife to just better understand who are all these different personalities. And along with the different personalities, you could even find more information specifically about those personalities. And this was just a way for Sky News to differentiate from the many others who also had access to the broadcast stream, the broadcast rights for this big event. And all they did is they just utilized technology to augment that experience just enough to make it that much more interesting for many of the viewers to want to watch Sky News as opposed to other forms of broadcast for that day. And the manner in which this is done, as it turns out, can be seen in some of our solutions. And so that we actually will provide with these solutions in certain cases. We'll actually provide a GitHub where you can actually see how these different services are connected together to make experiences like the one we just explained more meaningful, more relevant. But in essence, the way this is actually glued together is fairly simple. You're bringing in the video. In this case, we utilized Elemental Media Services to pull in a feed that would then be analyzed through the use of our ML recognition video service. And that extracted metadata, helped detect certain celebrity faces, for instance. It was also used in conjunction with Transcribe to actually extract some of the audio information from what was being utilized. And then all that information then gets placed in a database, is indexed for searchability or for bringing up that content when needed in the case of the mobile app that we just showed, for instance. Other examples, and we'll just move through them quickly, but other very meaningful examples, especially from an operational perspective, have to do, for instance, with compliance redaction. In the case on the upper left, what we're seeing is a situation whereby maybe an actual broadcaster maybe did not have the rights, for instance, to actually display the full open high-def version of an actor's face. And so in this case, utilizing ML, utilizing recognition, we're able to identify where the face is for this specific personality, and then we can blur it out. This is done really for demonstration purposes here, but we have examples to show you how to do that while only applying that change to the known actor in that case. Another example that we show on the bottom here has to do with compliance or standards and practice types of measurements, whereby maybe for kid programming, for instance, maybe you want to make sure that you can filter or properly tag whether there might be elements of violence in a given show. And so in this case, we trained a model to be able to detect whether weapons were involved, whether there was a gun, and could even calculate the probability of a certain type of gun, a handgun in this case. In the upper right, we actually did the same, trained a model to then determine whether a drinking activity was taking place. So in this case, the model was actually able to predict with nearly 70% accuracy that more than likely the content of the drinking right here had to do with alcohol and wine. One of my very favorite examples has to do with probably my second favorite sport, which is American football. American football, for those of you who may have watched it or who enjoy it, actually has quite a bit of complexity. There are many players moving around in different types of formation. And NFL, the National Football League, actually partnered with AWS to try to figure out how can we make games, football games, a more engaging experience to our fans. And the manner in which they did this is they actually took a lot of data that they had on the actual players. They're actually able to locate where the players are on the field, literally within inches of their location. They can also see what the speed of movement of those players are, what the acceleration might be for those players, and then probably more importantly, they can see how many of those players may line up in a certain formation. Based on all of that input data, they then utilize machine learning, in this case, utilize SageMaker to train a model to begin understanding what kind of formations, what kind of plays are these actual football players, is the quarterback going to do? What kind of run route will the receiver do that the quarterback is going to try to connect with? And based on all the data, they can also begin making inferences on what is the probability, for instance, that the quarterback is going to successfully reach his intended target. All data that is certainly of interest to coaches, but more importantly, to a lot of us as fans, being able to have that extra data just makes the experience that much more engaging, that much more fun. Certainly something that the NFL has actually been able to see with many of their customers. I won't go into the gory details of how a lot of this is done, other than just to call out that, once again, it's so important to make sure that you have access to a lot of these different data points. In the case of the NFL football example, for instance, a lot of the data has to do with being able to locate where the players are and then locate and identify their speeds and their acceleration and whatnot. Another example that does something similar with the car right there has to do with Formula One. In the case of Formula One, similar to the NFL experience, F1 approached AWS really wanting to try to figure out how they could leverage AWS machine learning to amount to a more meaningful fan engagement. And in this case, what they did actually is they analyzed a whole bunch of telemetry sensors. So they have 120 different sensors for each car that generate an enormous amount of data, I believe, right around 3 gigabits per second. And all that data is then being sent to the AWS cloud, and that same data then gets analyzed. And what they're able to do is make inferences from an operational perspective, but more interestingly, from a media perspective, they can also begin making inferences or provide better understanding as to some of the decisions that drivers might make. So they might be looking at, for instance, how hard is a driver braking? What is the temperature of their tires? What are some of the acceleration? How many G's is that driver preparing to pull as he gets into the turn? And a lot of these different data points allow F1, for instance, to make inferences on the probability of whether one driver might be in the position to overtake another driver. And many other inferences, of course. But these same inferences can then be shared with the broadcasters of F1. And once again, it just becomes one additional way to make that engagement with the fans that much more interesting. These are ways that ultimately allow you to reduce churn, to increase revenue opportunity. And that's really what they are looking out to do. And I'll finish up with a couple examples around sports. This is one where we're able to identify some of the different players. Actually, before we get to my last example, really my favorite example, we'll actually talk a little bit about how this is done. Similar to the prior example, in this case, what we're doing is we're actually going to train the model, and what we did is we trained the model based on all the different players. So we had images of all those different players that were provided by the league. We input that into our data lake. We trained our model and trained recognition ultimately to be able to detect these different players. And based on that, we were able to then path and follow the actual player movement, the player activity, and based on the analysis, the matching capabilities, we're able to show all that information on the screen. Once again, just allowing for a more engaging experience. And I'll finish up right here on one last example. And this is one in which we've trained the machine learning model to detect when a goal, for instance, just occurred. Or better yet, as we're moving along right after the goal, what you'll see is that we're about to see an infraction. I think we're about to see a foul. And in this case, the foul was actually anticipated. And then you also saw the yellow card right there. We anticipated the yellow card, and then we're confirming that the yellow card is happening with all these different activities identified. We're identifying a corner kick right here with very high likelihood, high probability. And finally, we identified a substitution occurring. And once again, this is primarily really just to demonstrate all the many capabilities, all the many things that can be done in a cloud-type environment. And so I'll just leave you with all of that information. We would love to talk to you more about how AWS can help with your transformations. Please look us up. Please make sure that you fill out the survey for this talk. And in closing, just wanted to thank you. Kamsa Hamnida.